Boring is one of the harshest social verdicts a person can receive. It implies emptiness, that there's simply not much going on inside. But spend enough time actually paying attention to people who get labeled that way, and a different picture tends to emerge. Not always, but often enough to be worth examining. Because some of the most substantive people you'll ever encounter are the ones who come across as boring in the wrong context. And understanding why reveals something interesting, not just about them, but about what we're actually measuring when we call someone boring in the first place. Here are 5 traits that tend to get misread as dullness. The first one is the most fundamental. People who seem boring often don't need external stimulation to feel okay. They can sit with quiet. They can be alone without reaching for something to fill the space. They can be in a room where nothing particularly exciting is happening and not feel the creeping restlessness that drives most people toward their phones or toward performing interests they don't feel. From the outside, this looks like passivity, like not much is going on. But what it actually represents, in most cases, is a well-developed inner life, one that doesn't require constant input from outside to sustain itself. These people have learned, somewhere along the way, to be genuinely comfortable in their own company. That's rarer than it sounds. Psychologists who study what's called need for stimulation, the degree to which a person seeks external novelty and excitement, have found that people who score lower on this trait are not less alive. They process experience more deeply rather than more broadly. They're drawing on internal resources, reflection, imagination, their own ongoing thinking, in ways that aren't visible to an observer, but that produce a kind of sustained engagement with their own experience that most people never quite achieve. The second trait follows directly. Before getting there, it's worth pausing on what the first trait produces in social settings. When someone doesn't need external stimulation, they also tend not to generate it, not because they can't contribute, but because they're not driven to fill silence or manufacture energy. And in most social environments, people who aren't actively generating energy get overlooked. The energy goes toward whoever is producing the most of it. The quiet person in the corner, perfectly at ease, thinking their own thoughts, registers as background. They usually aren't. These people have largely stopped trying to perform. They've passed through whatever phase of life involved impressing people and come out the other side. And because they're no longer working to make themselves interesting to a room, they can come across as flat, as if nothing much is happening, when what's actually happening is that they've simply stopped putting energy into the performance. There's a specific kind of presence that certain people have, the kind that fills a room with energy, that generates excitement, that makes interactions feel dynamic and alive. That presence is real, and it's valuable, but it's also partly constructed. It's something that takes effort to produce and maintain, and it signals something specific, that the person producing it is still oriented around how they're being perceived. People who seem boring have often moved past that orientation. They're not less than people who perform, they're just no longer in the same game. And the absence of the performance, to people who are still playing that game, reads as absence of substance. It isn't. It's just substance that isn't being displayed for the room. The third trait is the one that most directly explains why these people are misread in social situations. They listen more than they talk. Not because they have nothing to say. Because they genuinely find other people interesting, and they're not competing for airtime. In most social contexts, especially large gatherings, casual parties, surface-level networking, conversation runs on a kind of implicit competition where people are waiting for their turn, monitoring the response to what they're saying, projecting presence. Someone who isn't playing that game, who is mostly listening and asking questions, and occasionally contributing something quiet and precise, can seem to have nothing to offer. But flip the context. Put that person in a one-on-one conversation that goes deep, or in a situation that requires genuine attention to what's being said rather than performance of what's being felt. And suddenly the dynamic reverses entirely. The person who seemed to have nothing to say turns out to be the one who heard everything, who noticed what no one else noticed, who asks the question that changes the direction of the whole conversation. These people aren't boring. They're calibrated for depth. They just look boring in the environments that are optimized for surface. The fourth trait is the one that's hardest to see from the outside, almost by definition. People who seem boring often have rich and detailed inner lives that simply don't show up in their external presentation. A sustained interior engagement with ideas, with questions, with observations about the world and about themselves, an ongoing conversation they're having with their own mind that doesn't need an audience and doesn't get expressed in the social signals most people use to signal that something interesting is happening inside them. Research on what psychologists call inner experience, the quality and density of a person's ongoing internal mental activity, has found enormous variation between people, with almost no reliable correlation to how they come across in social interaction. Some of the most internally active people are among the quietest in a room. Some of the most performatively engaging people have relatively thin internal lives, and their energy goes into the performance rather than into genuine reflection. People who seem boring in the conventional sense are often the ones who have developed a rich relationship with their own thinking and haven't particularly felt the need to advertise it. They're not withholding. They're just not orienting their inner life outward, which is actually the more unusual way to relate to your own mind. The fifth trait is the one that tends to be most undervalued in the moment and most appreciated over time. These people are consistent. They show up the same way across different situations and different moods. What they say today reflects what they believe tomorrow. Their character doesn't shift depending on who's in the room or what the social incentives are. They don't have an interesting version and an unguarded version. There's just the one version, which presents itself reliably. That consistency can read as flatness. There's no drama in it, no variability, no peaks that make an interaction feel special. But consider what its absence looks like. People who shift depending on context, who perform certain qualities with some people and different qualities with others, who keep you slightly uncertain about who they actually are. That variability can be exciting. It can also be exhausting and, over time, destabilizing. What people who seem boring offer, their steadiness, their reliability, their unchanged character, is something that turns out to be deeply valuable in the contexts that matter most. Serious friendships, long-term relationships, collaborations that require trust. The foundation they provide is one that most people spend years looking for in people who seemed much more interesting at first. There is also something worth noting about the long game these people tend to play in relationships. First impressions favor the energetic, the expressive, the ones who project presence. But over time, the qualities that produce boring first impressions, the consistency, the depth, the absence of performance, compound in ways that more dynamic personalities often don't. People who seemed interesting at the start can become exhausting or unreliable over time. People who seemed boring can become irreplaceable. The timeline on which boring gets reassessed is usually longer than a single conversation or a first meeting, but the reassessment tends to happen. Boring, in other words, is often a first impression category that doesn't hold up over time. What it usually means in practice is this person doesn't perform for the room. And the people who don't perform for the room are often the ones, once you've found a way in, who have the most to offer once you get there. If that resonated, leave a comment. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the next video.